Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for your patience. I'm afraid we have been experiencing a few technical difficulties today. And for those of you who are expecting to see Rebecca, unfortunately, she wasn't available tonight, so you've got me instead. So my name's Heather McCalman, and I work for HCC on the Stoc project across the Red Meat Development Programme. And tonight, we're very lucky to have Kate Phillips, who is a sheep specialist, has a wealth of experience in sheep health, sheep nutrition, who'll be giving us a bit of a presentation on, all being well, on these issues. And joining her is Alice, who you can see on screen now, Alice Jackson, who has been working with Market Hall Vets for over 3 years. She's one of our most enthusiastic and helpful vets on the Stoc project, and she will be sort of covering the health type issues relating to ewe management at this time of year. Obviously, we're in mid-pregnancy for many, or early pregnancy for some, depending on your lambing date. And we are obviously trying to tackle and plan ahead for a successful lambing. It's important that we do think about this. And I'm going to just ask Alice, just a few questions. And if any of you have some questions that you'd like to ask Alice, she's an experienced sheep vet. Please do just pop your questions in the stage, which is the chat function, and then we'll do our best to tackle those. So firstly, Alice, what do you think is the kind of things that we should be looking to tackle at this stage in pregnancy, given the range of sheep flocks that we have across Wales?
Around this sort of time, what I usually find is I'm down in Southwest Wales, people are lambing earlier and earlier and earlier. So we're actually starting to get people already putting their ewes inside. So for those of you that are already doing that, we tend to find things like scab, there's a rise in scab cases, a rise in lameness. I find it really useful with the HCC funding to organise a visit then about the 5-point plan. And for your scab, then it's quite useful using either the HCC funding of the £300 of diagnostics, or even the Farming Connect funding that's just come out on the 1st of December, to utilise that for skin scrapes. And if you're sat there thinking, the last time I did skin scrapes, I yielded a negative result, I didn't find it particularly helpful, well, you can always do a blood sample about 2 weeks later as well, once the negative scrapes have come back. And you tend to find once the farmer's actually seen its ewes, and by the time you've got negative results come back, that it's enough time has actually lapsed that you can do a blood sample. For those of you earlier, well, lambing later then, so sort of mid-pregnancy, I tend to find over-conditioned and under-conditioned ewes. The things you start to see because of your over-conditioned and under-conditioned ewes are things like pregnancy toxemia, the twin lamb later on. Hypocalcemia you can also get as a nutrition issue around mid-pregnancy, and that can result in the hypocalcemia later on, so that's a lack of calcium. Both of those diseases then cause, like, your classic signs of a twin lamb. So your ewe separates herself off from everyone else. She kind of goes into this sort of comatose-like state, totally unaware that you're there. Some good things to think of are, and also you've got your prolapses and lambs that are either too thin or too fat, So things to think about then would be, I find really useful, is like pre-lambing bloods. So testing for BHBs. So these are indicators that you've got the ewe mobilizing energy stores off her own back rather than actually from the feed. So a high BHB level would mean there's not really sufficient energy in her diet. It would also test for urea. Urea is like a indicator of protein status then in your feed as well. It would test for albumin. Albumin is like a longer protein status, and also can pick up on any chronic inflammatory diseases then, like liver fluke or a worm burden. It will also test for a magnesium. So high levels of magnesium or adequate levels of magnesium are a good indicator that your calcium levels will hopefully be sufficient later on in your pregnancy, because magnesium helps mobilize calcium at the receptors in the body, ready for sort of growing those fetuses and ready for the lactation of the ewe. I also throw it, I've got some questions here, hang on. How do you recommend metabolic testing? Okay, so it's at least 6 to 8 ewes, at least. The more the merrier is better. You want it at least 3 to 4 weeks before you're lambing, because you want enough time to actually implement any changes rather than, you know, once the horse is bolted. So I tend to tie it in with 4 to 6 weeks when they're doing the Heptavac P to try and prevent double handling, but it doesn't matter if you do. So what I tend to do is 4 to 6 weeks before lambing. I like to do at least 12 bloods if I can. And the reason why I do that is often the farmer has got them separated into singles, doubles, and triplets. I like to do 4 at least from each group. You do the thinnest, the fattest, and 2 in the middle, rather than doing 4 of your thinnest and 4 of your fattest. You'll just skew your results completely. Also, whilst I do this, I can see somebody's written, what would be your view on feeding mid-pregnancy ewes on stubble turnips? Stubble turnips are cheap. I'll get back to the bloods in a second, but stubble turnips are cheap. It's a nice, well, relatively cheap, good energy source. However, there are a few things related with it. You've got to make sure they're trained to it. You don't want to put them all on at the tops and try and jump out on you or break through the fence. So you've got to be trained to it, strip gazing ideally. Also, they've got to have like a run back area with farm assurance if you are farm assured. So an area where they can lie down, etc. And also with double turnips like root and brassicas, you can find that it locks up iodine, so it alters the thyroid function of the ewe. So it can lock up iodine on the ewe, and that can result in a lack of iodine. And if you do get a lack of iodine, like an iodine deficiency, what you tend to find is lambs, when they can lack that sort of vigor. And worst case scenario, if you've got iodine deficiency really bad, it can actually result in some stillborns, but they tend to lack that vigor. Also with stubble turnips, we have had ewes that have resulted in selenium deficiency. So when the lambs have, like when they've lambed down, the lambs have ended up with white muscle disease. I don't know if anybody's ever come into contact with that, but it's like sort of these lambs that are weak and sometimes shake, and that sort of like inability to stand sometimes. So that can also arise from your stubble turnip feeding. But I do think it's a really good source of energy. I don't want that to put anybody off. But whilst I'm doing the pre-bloods on the Stoc Plus project, then whilst I do those pre-lambing bloods, I will ask them questions like, what have they been fed on? And if I am worried about an iodine or a selenium deficiency, I'll throw in an inorganic iodine pooled sample or a GSHPX and a vitamin E for the selenium. I also look if they're black face or white face ewes. I'll throw in a copper if I'm worried if they're darker face ewe, or if the ground that they're on is actually known for being copper deficient. So that's a really good thing I like to do, definitely, is pre-lambing bloods. And it's nice to get your hands on the ewes as well. Myself included, sometimes you can get a little bit fixated on the separate groups at lambing time. So, you know, your singles, your twins and your triplets. It's a really good guide to go off. But putting your hands on your ewes 4 to 6 weeks at least before lambing. And if you've got a ewe that's a single and she's struggling, bump her up into the twins, definitely. So it's a nice way to like have a look and see how they are getting on.
Thank you, Alice. That's really good, because coming, you know, we're sort of around towards scanning time now, which is mid pregnancy, which I think the questioner has been suggesting. You know, stubble turnips might be adequate nutrition wise during mid-pregnancy, but obviously your protein demands are going to increase during later pregnancy. We just had another question in about if you've got ewes up on the hill, how you know, lambing in April, is there any sort of tips or advice that you could give to help them monitor and maintain body condition for hill ewes?
Yeah, so you've also got the practical issues of actually getting them in constantly isn't really well, you don't get them in constantly anyway, but yeah, the main thing is body. I couldn't stress body condition really enough. With your hill ewes, obviously it's a little bit less. The AHGB guidelines do state with lowland ewes, then you go a 3.5 at tupping, 3.5 at mid, and then that falls to a 3 at lambing. Your upland would then be a 3 at tupping, a 3 mid, and then about 2.5 at lambing. And then for your hills, you tend to find it's 2.5 at tupping. I know it sounds, but 2.5 at tupping, 2.5 at mid, and then you find it goes to about a 2. So if you can keep those body conditions up as best you can, that'd be great. As far as some tips on hill, well, it depends how hilly and how we can actually provide nutrition. I've seen people chuck out some fodder beet in the field if it's possible up there. I've seen people, rather than doing towards the end of pregnancy, rather than doing little cake, they do rolls, things so they're not stamping it in the ground. Just practical.
And I think it's actually kind of also possible to sort of assess the grassland that is available to them, and that does, if there's a good rules of thumb then, that you obviously, if you've got a snowfall, you've got to supplement with something. But as you've pointed out, lower body condition score is more acceptable and more suitable for hill ewes with probably just one lamb inside them.
Yeah.
We've had another couple really good questions actually, just picking back up on if we stick with stubble turnips a little bit longer. Somebody's been asking, how would you get iodine and selenium into your ewes if you are feeding on stubble turnips with a run back or with a fibre source? How would you get the iodine and selenium in?
I probably would get boluses. I know that some people get a little bit worried about bolusing their ewes, but that is probably one of your, if you're going to do a combined, doing a selenium and an iodine on a bolus would be probably the best way to go about that then.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah. I was just ahead of this question from Nia. I was just going to say, go back to the sort of the lameness, the foot problems that you might experience, say, a couple of weeks or a week after housing, and just linking to what Nia's question is how would you manage if that foot lameness problem was cod? What approaches would you take to try and manage that?
Okay, so first off, I'd probably hopefully you're doing this before lambing, but if it's in lambing, that's fine. I tend to ask the farmer which group gets it the worst, because you tend to find if they are indoors, they are putting one specific group at a higher stocking density, and it tends to be singles, and it actually flags up in your singles more than the other groups. So trying to just manage that, kind of figure out which group it tends to be at. If it's all of them, foot batting around lambing time isn't ideal, is it? And also going through the 5-point plan. So your classic, your 5 prongs. I don't know if everyone knows this, but you've got culling ewes but you're not going to cull them now that they're pregnant. But you've got cull, quarantine any bought-in ones, vaccinate if it's a foot rot issue. So getting a vet to actually come out and diagnose whether or not it is foot rot or cod. Then you've got sort of avoiding as best you can. So trying to reduce that stocking density, very difficult inside, I'm well aware, but trying to keep them clean. It's literally spreading from one footprint and somebody stepping into another sheep stepping into someone else's footprint. That's how it's spread about. So trying to keep the hygiene as best you possibly can. Trying to avoid poached areas. Like I've seen in lambing sheds, people have little molasses tubs and it gets a little bit damp around them and it's getting a bit poached. Try and move them around as best you can. If you can't, then put a bit of lime down around them, even bits of wood chip, anything that's going to stop it from poaching in those areas. And then obviously you've got treatment as quickly as possible. And when you are treating as quickly as possible, try and treat for the disease then. So for example, a foot rot starts off in between the digits. So and then spreads outwards. It has that classic sort of foot rot smell about it. With those, you want to target it with like an oxytetracycline, whereas a cod then, contagious ovine digital dermatitis, would start at the coronary band and move downwards. It doesn't particularly have that smell, but just watch, because you can have cod and foot rot at the same time. So just watch that, and it will typically move downwards. People often talk about, oh, well, the outer shell of the hoof came off, so it must be foot rot. No, it can be foot rot or cod. Both can cause that outer shell of the foot to actually come off then. And with the cod, I'd probably use amoxicillin. Gwen?
I was just going to say, do you have any thoughts on, I know there's been quite a lot of discussion on this, do you have any thoughts on foot trimming, when and when not to foot trim?
Okay, so the trouble is I can get a little bit anecdotal at times, so I'll try not to. With this, they talk about how it's ideal to not foot trim and to actually treat them first. Okay, it does go against what a lot of farmers want to do, and I know that. My dad being one that says good wood doesn't grow on dead wood, but basically treat it first and then go back to it. Because what tends to happen is that you see a ewe and you go straight for the lame one, and you see everybody does it. They put the fingers in between, they're giving it a good sniff, and then they've gone from that foot straight to the other 3 feet, and you've spread it to the other ones. So that's the idea, is you're not foot trimming this one. You probably might hit a little bit of corium, a little bit of blood, and then you've gone straight to another foot then, or of someone else, and you pass it between. So that's the idea, is that you don't want to spread it. So what I tend to do when I'm like going amongst a flock, if I've got a ewe that is lame, you identify which leg it's in. Okay, right, it's in a front right, and that is the last foot I'm going to go to. I go to every single one before the last one. Okay, and if I'm honest, I just look and try and identify what it is. Okay, and I see what it is, and often I won't foot trim, I'll just inject her. And it's just that idea of identifying what it is and going to her lame foot last. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant, excellent answer. Thank you very much.
So stop me.
So you're doing great. It's just dotting around a little bit. We've just had another question in about we all that we've probably got our ewes on a vaccination program, whether it's the 2 different commercial brands, but they're basically Clostridial and Pastorella. When is the best time to vaccinate pregnant ewes? Sort of once they're on the scheme, or could you just run through the principles of making sure that we do that right?
Yeah, so usually 4 to 6 weeks before lambing then, and that's to give a passive transfer to the lambs through the colostrum of antibodies. And then once the lambs are born down then, we tend to do with lambs that are pet lambs, you can go as early as 3 weeks of age actually, and do them twice, 4 weeks apart. But with lambs that are on ewes, you tend to find that they won't do them until like weaning time, so about 12 weeks of age, and then they'll do it twice. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. The other one that we haven't touched on yet is I know that especially as it's been so wet and the weather patterns are changing so much, and liver fluke is a perennial problem on many sheep farms. Have you got any thoughts on when and if it's possible to test for fluke burns? Just basically any thoughts you might have at this time of year for sheep and fluke?
Yeah. With fluke, so the Stoc website, I don't know if anybody's familiar with it, but it basically is a really good way. If you Google Stocs, it's all about like sheep worming and flukicides and fluking if you use them. And on the Stoc website, they've put on that try and avoid just doing them for fluke, just because you've always done it that way, because the actual year and the the life cycle of the fluke now is less predictable than it once was. You know, you got to sort of autumn, early winter time, and you found that it was the early immature flukes, and you came all the way around and you find your late and your matures are a sort of around springtime. It's getting less and less predictable now, with you getting wet summers or really long, dry spring, etc. It's getting very difficult to predict. So what they suggest now is actually testing for it before you do it. So testing for, well, you can do a fecal egg for the fluke, and that will realistically be, the fluke's about 10 to 12 weeks old then. And then you can do a copper antigen test, and that's 2 to 3 weeks before that again. So you tend to find that's about the 6 to 7 week mark. And then you can go for an antibody test, like a blood test of the fluke, and that will do from 2 weeks after they have been infected. There is also some liver enzymes that you can do. With the liver enzymes, that isn't it is diagnostic, but probably one of the other options would be better then. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. No, thank you very much. It's a very comprehensive answer. I just got one very quick question for you, and then hopefully we may be able to go to Kate. I've just had a question about, there's a lot of talk at the moment of fodder beet, a very high yielding crop that's filling the gap during the winter stages. Is there anything particular we should look out for, and supplement wise, to make sure the diet's balanced when you've got a very high energy crop like fodder beet?
Yeah, just making sure you've got enough protein in your diet as well. So yeah, with your pre-lambing bloods, with your Stoc Plus project, that would pick that up then, definitely, because you need the protein as well as the energy. Yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, they've been coming in well. The only other health issue that we haven't picked up on was
probably abortion.
Was abortion, yes. So any thoughts on what we should be looking at this time of year? Is there anything we should be doing or not?
Yeah, so at this time of year, you won't, well, unless you're really looking out for it, you won't really see the fetus in the placenta unless you're really, really on the ball. You'll probably just see some ewes with a little bit of blood on their tail. So obviously the main two causes of abortion in the UK are enzootic abortion is the top one, and toxoplasmosis. So you can do blood testing at this time of the year, and depending on who your vet is, they might be able to like sweet talk a drug rep and ask for some free maybe flock check forms and get some use under that scheme. So that would be testing for antibodies against toxo and enzo. If you are worried about other things though, you can test for other things like Campylobacter, Salmonella, that kind of stuff, Q fever. But the gold standard would be to send off the fetus and the placenta. That would be gold standard then. Okay,
brilliant. Thank you very much. I'm just going to say good evening to Kate and see whether she can hear us.
But they're the main ones, really. Scab, lameness, we see at this time of year, your abortions, and then just your, well, coming into your late pregnancy and your lambing illnesses. Also having a chat, using the HCC funding to have a chat about lambing before it happens, like your neonatal diseases, watery mouth, your joint ill, things like that. Just getting a preparation how you can prevent it before it actually happens, because once it's in an outbreak, it can be a bit annoying. Down here actually is quite a dairy area, and it's and I'm from Cheshire, which is well, it's also a dairy area, but I didn't have any dairy cows on my farm, so I hadn't come across crypto in the lambs before I came down here. And that's also something that happens when you've got calves and calf sheds, and then you're using them for your lambing sheds then. So that's also something to think about.
I think, in summary, though, at this time of year, we're coming up to scanning. We've been talking about the value of condition scoring. Scanning is an opportunity to do that, to adjust our groups and sort of use that on that basis.
Yeah.
And then I think Kate has an excellent presentation, which we would love to be able to share with you. That kind of runs through things relating to mid-pregnancy and how we can plan ahead for ready for lambing and to ensure that lambs get a good start with adequate colostrum.
We had a question.
Oh, well done. Yeah, far away. Yeah.
It says, have you had any experience of the sheep mastitis vaccine? Limited, because not many people have taken it up yet. But one thing I would suggest is culture some of your mastitis. If you've got high mastitis in your ewes, don't just assume it will do against with the vaccine. Then go culture it and make sure it actually is the Staph aureus then.
Okay. Thank you very much, Alice. I think now we can hand over to Kate. Laurie, the screen share now, hopefully you should all be able to see the first slide. And I'd like to just hand over to Kate, and thank you all very much in the audience for your patience with our technical problems, but I'm sure it's worth waiting for.
So everybody, I hope, has similar targets for their flock. We want optimum conception rate. You'll note I haven't said maximum because that can often be counterproductive. We actually have too many triplets and end up with higher losses. So it's optimum conception rate for the system you're running. We want to hang on to those newly fertilised embryos and minimise any loss, and certainly want to keep any fetuses that have been connected to the ewe by the placenta alive and well, and take them right through to being viable lambs capable of fast growth. And we also want to make sure that we prime the ewe to produce good quality colostrum and milk, and that we've done that at least cost, really. So we've not ended up having to feed huge amounts of concentrates to achieve that, but we've actually managed to maximise utilisation of homegrown forages, grass, root crops, whatever is on the farm, to actually keep the costs of production low. So just to remind you of some sort of fundamentals, really, target condition scores are key to success. So we really very much encourage everybody to be doing consistent and regular monitoring of body condition score throughout the year. And this tells us so much about health and nutrition. It can pick up when animals are under the weather in terms of disease, and may be the first sign you've got an issue with liver fluke or with one of the iceberg diseases. It could simply be telling you that you're not feeding them well enough, and really just to keep an eye on condition throughout the year. Whenever you've got ewes nearby, putting your hand on the back over the loin area to assess the fat cover and muscle depth. Really, really important. So what I'm going to be talking about today is trying to make sure that between tupping and scanning, we're holding new body condition rather than letting it slip. And given the weather we've had, I'm sitting here in Shropshire and it's been raining incessantly for the last 24 hours, given the weather we've had, dry matter of grass is very low, and have you really got enough dry matter on the ground to be sustaining ewes and allowing them a slight improvement in body weight in this period of time, in the last in the middle 2 months of pregnancy. So really important to be keeping a check on condition scores. So hopefully lowland type ewes, we're going to be topping at 3.5 and holding that condition right through to lambing if possible. And likewise with hill ewes, we're hoping to keep them at 2.5 condition score from topping right through to lambing. So just to give you an idea of what's happening inside the ewe, obviously day one is when the ewe is mated, and fertilisation takes place about within the next 3 days. The tiny little embryo then migrates up the fallopian tubes into the uterus and starts to implant around day 19 into the side of the uterus. So we're developing the placenta and the cotyledons that attach the lamb to the ewe. And that is a really critical stage that we need to be so careful with how we manage our ewes up to implantation. Those embryos are very sensitive to stress and changes in the uterus. Thinking about the fluids in the uterus, they can be affected by animals undergoing stress or by nutritional changes. So it's really important that those ewes are kept as stress-free as possible, and that means keeping their diet the same too. So what I'm going to be looking at mostly is this period sort of from a day about 40 to day 90. So in that period, the fetus weighs only about 5 grams, but increases to about 700 grams in that time. But the major amount of growth is within the placenta. And the placenta has such a key role in producing lambs of good weight and healthy, fit, viable lambs. So this gives a sort of schematic diagram of what's happening inside the ewe. So if the left-hand column is weight of the lamb, weight of the placenta or the lamb, and you can see we've mentioned about the critical implantation period around about day 34, completed by about then, and then we'll be talking about the development of the placenta, starting slowly around about day 40, starting to build up and increase in size till it actually reaches its maximum size about 80 to 90 days into the pregnancy. And then, of course, you're all very well aware of the rapid increase in nutritional requirements needed to grow those lambs in the last few weeks before lambing, with about 70 to 75% of fetal growth happening in those last few weeks. So in early pregnancy, environmental stresses, cold weather, can actually reduce embryo survival. So any repeated stress, such as yarding and handling, increases embryonic loss through partial, that might be just losing one embryo, or complete loss of embryos. So mismanaging ewes in that very early stage of pregnancy can end up with quite a few barren ewes or more singles than you really wanted. Some work in New Zealand has showed that stressed ewes may lose up to about 30% of the potential embryos, compared to with only 17% for non-stressed ewes. And in any species, you are going to get embryonic loss because that's just the way nature works. But if we can minimise those numbers of embryos lost, then we'll end up with a better scanning percentage and more lambs reared. So in months 2 and 3 of pregnancy, we're now getting more and more evidence that suggests that if ewes tend to gain a little weight between mating and scanning, that their scanning percentages are better. We were led to believe, and maybe for some ewes, fit ewes, very fit ewes, these ewes in body condition score 4+, that a small amount of live weight loss would be beneficial. But for the majority of ewes that are on target condition score for mating, at 3.5 for lowland ewes, then maintaining that condition right through to scanning and up to lambing is what we're really trying to achieve. So what we should be doing is planning for a slightly higher than maintenance level of feeding to achieve this. And always remember that ewe lambs and shearlings are much more sensitive to embryonic loss, so they need to be handled with great care. How we feed the ewe and how we influence the uterine environment can have long-lasting effects on the lifetime performance of the lambs born to that ewe. So just a couple of examples. Undernutrition in mid-late pregnancy tends to result in fewer wool follicles, coarser fibres and lighter fleeces. And many of you may think, well, I'm not too worried about wool at the moment, given how terrible the prices have been, but you never know, it might improve. And certainly we need a reasonable wool covering of lambs, obviously, particularly those born outside. So that is important in terms of lamb survival. It's also been found that how we feed the ewe can influence the fetal ovaries, so that progeny, those lambs born to that ewe, can actually produce fewer eggs in her lifetime. So there are long-term effects, not just the impact of that on that ewe and the lambs born, but how that lamb actually performs in future years. So just to give you an idea of the sort of scale we're talking about, so at about 50 days into the pregnancy, the baby lamb is going to be something like about 3 centimetres long. It actually increases quite dramatically to weigh probably 700, 800 grams at about 100 days of age within the pregnancy. And of course, at full term, we're hoping we've got something like, depending on the breed, somewhere between 4.5 and 5.5 kilogram lambs being born. And just wanted to show you this little slide from Redmere, a paper by Redmere, just trying to look at how adult females would partition the nutrients they actually receive in their diet to different functions within the body. So if we start at the bottom left-hand corner of this slide, the most important organ or system in the body is the brain and the central nervous system. So that would have a draw on the nutrients in the bloodstream first. Then we'd have a draw from bone, muscle, and finally fat. Obviously, you all would know, it's finally fat that a lamb would put on once it's actually developed the bone and the muscle. So fat is always last in line to get the extra nutrients. So the ewe is able, depending on the supply of nutrients, to prioritise nutrients for different tissues within the body. But in the pregnant ewe, it's a little bit different. So you can see at the bottom of this slide, the priority actually goes to the placenta and the fetus. So that comes first, and that is the most important function we have here. So that is getting lots of nutrients along with the brain and the central nervous system. But if you think of twin lamb disease, the ewe tends to prioritise the placenta and the fetus in late pregnancy over her own brain because it is lack of glucose to her brain that causes the twin lamb symptoms. So the ewe is able to prioritise where the nutrients go. So the mother's nutrient supply affects the fetal supply because if we really do run short of nutrients, then the placenta and the fetus don't develop. The biggest impact on fetal weight is obviously with regard to feeding throughout the period, but fetal weight is largely determined by 90 days pregnant, but obviously late pregnancy feeding does have an impact too. So just to summarise this slide, the pregnancy is very important, more important than maternal bone, muscle and fat. So that just puts in perspective, I think, how valued that pregnancy is to the ewe, and it's only her brain and central nervous system that can, in line for nutrients when she's pregnant. So initially in early pregnancy, something called the corpus luteum actually produces progesterone to start the pregnancy or maintain the pregnancy. But gradually the placenta develops, so that takes over progesterone production. It also produces other hormones which are essential for pregnancy and for the development of the udder, colostrum and milk production. So if we have poor development of the placenta, we're going to get lower levels of hormones produced. So getting that pregnancy, that placenta developed properly is really key to success of any pregnancy. So the final size of the placenta largely determines lamb birth weight. And I do remember somebody contacted me a couple of years ago to say how could they reduce the lamb birth weight. And obviously it's very hard to limit feeding in late pregnancy, otherwise you're going to run into twin lamb disease. But actually I think her problem was probably in the sense that, I shouldn't say it's a problem really, that she was doing the ewes incredibly well in mid-pregnancy and determining the birth weight of lambs. And however she was amending late pregnancy feeding, she didn't seem to be able to impact on the lamb birth weight. So each lamb has its own placenta, so the total weight of the placentas in twins or triplets will be greater than for a single, so more hormones produced. So that's why for ewes with multiple lambs, the ewe will actually produce more milk than ewes with singles, because the udder has been primed to be actually supplying or feeding more than one lamb. And interestingly, placenta hormones are also responsible for the bond between the ewe and her lamb immediately after lambing. I just wanted to show you this little slide, and you've probably seen it many times before, but just demonstrating the survivability of lambs by birth weight. So on the left-hand column, we have mortality rate. So if you look at the first little dot on that graph at 2 kilograms live weight for the lamb, a 40% mortality. But you can see mortality gets lower and lower and lower in this example, and is down to literally about between 5 and 10% when the lamb birth weight is between 3.5 and 5 kilograms for this particular breed of sheep. And this actually is work from Cathy Dwyer, who's a researcher, a professor in Scotland at SAC, and this was on Scottish blackface lambs, and she decided that the optimal birth weight for Scottish blackface lambs was 3.5 to 5 kilograms. And as you come across the scale on the bottom, and you've got 7 kilo lambs, we've got actually mortality just as high as those lambs that were born at 2 kilos, in fact slightly higher. So really key to getting optimal birth weight is getting that placenta developed well, and thinking about late pregnancy feeding too. But weight gain in the ewe can have a positive influence on birth weight of lambs, and it can result in improved survival of multiples by simply moving them to from being light lambs into a higher survival bracket. So we've talked about feeding just slightly above maintenance at this point in the pregnancy, in mid-pregnancy. So I just wanted to walk you through some simple calculations that can be done to try to estimate what your ewes would need. So to work out maintenance requirements, a very simple calculation is 1.8 plus 10% of the ewe body weight. So literally 1.8 plus 0.1 times 70 would give us the megajoules of energy needed for a 70 kilo ewe. So there we are, 1.8 plus 7 is 8.8 megajoules per day for maintenance. And for a 50 kilogram hill type ewe, you'd be talking about 6.8 megajoules. So at this point in the pregnancy, we generally allow something like 1.5% of body weight as dry matter intake. So for a 70 kilo ewe, that would literally be 1.5 times 70 divided by 100 would give us 1.05 kilograms of dry matter intake per day. And if that was literally from grass alone, winter grass of 10 megajoules per kilogram dry matter, that would give us 10.5 megajoules per day, a little above maintenance. So maintenance being 8.8 and 10.5 being just about 1.7 megajoules above that. So a little above maintenance. So winter grass at only 13% dry matter, and as I sit here in Shropshire, it's really been very, very heavy rain over the last sort of 36 hours, and dry matters can be very low. So if it was 13% dry matter grass, that would be equivalent to about 8 kilograms of fresh grass per day, which is quite a mountain if you cut that and saw what the pile looked like. So can they eat that much? Certainly when conditions are very, very wet, it is quite hard for you to actually eat all the dry matter she needs if the feed is wet. So, you know, there is a need in many situations to be providing additional dry forage in the terms of hay or big bale silage. And I just want to remind everybody that a leaner ewe will eat about 30% more than a fit ewe. So it's always important to budget for this because you're actually wanting those ewes to gain some condition. So you do need to put more feed into the diet to make sure she can do that. But hoping that you've got something like, you know, if you've been condition scoring regularly through the year, you've got something like, you know, most of the ewes are on target condition score and there shouldn't be need for that. But there's always some individuals who need a bit of extra help. So I wanted you to say a little bit about transitioning to a new feed. Now, a complete no-no is changing the ewe's diet in the first 5 weeks of pregnancy. I've explained how the pregnancy develops and the implantation of the the embryo into the uterine lining is only complete at about 34 days of pregnancy. So it is important not to disturb or to introduce new feeds into the ration, because simply you can have an impact on the uterine environment and change the nutrients within there, and it may change and not be as nutritious to that new embryo. So if you are changing diet, wait till after the first 5 weeks of pregnancy, and when changing, do it gradually. So you can imagine, can't you, that if you move from a nice grazing situation on grass, a perennial ryegrass mix or whatever, and you move straight into a crop like this in the picture, then you are going to get quite a big shift in the diet and a change in rumen environment. So very important to do things slowly. Just a little walk through that. So if you were moving from grazing to roots, you should use a couple of hours access to new crop each day and build up over a week or two. Always allow a grass run backs as an alternative diet for the ewes to be eating should grazing conditions in the roots be poor, and always offer some dry forage in terms of hay or silage. And ideally, roots should make up about 70% of the diet dry matter, making up the deficit with the hay or silage. It's always better to strip grazer roots. If you think about a root crop, maybe fodder beet, the tops are full of protein and minerals, and the roots are mainly sugar. So if you let ewes into a field of any root crop, they would tend to strip off all the leaves first, hence getting a high protein diet, and then they'd come back and then they'd eat the roots, which would be a low protein diet but high energy. So it's much better to strip graze the roots so that you're actually getting a balance of energy and protein as you move across the crop. The other thing to think about with any root crop is trace element supplementation. Iodine deficiency is quite common when grazing roots, and certainly selenium and copper can be an issue too. So really important to make sure those are provided as necessary. So just a reminder about what trace elements are important for. Cobalt is required for the metabolism of carbohydrates in the body, so it is important to have that in the diet every day for sheep, because the rumen makes vitamin B12 from the cobalt, and the B12 is involved in the carbohydrate metabolism. So really important cobalt in terms of embryo development. So it has been shown in research work that cobalt deficient ewes do have less viable embryos. Important also with selenium and vitamin E, that has been shown to increase embryo loss at implantation if we have low levels of those two. And selenium is very highly implemented in immunity to disease. So those two are very critical at this point in time. Lack of iodine, likewise, iodine's part of thyroid hormone thyroxine, and is in basically manages the metabolism of the body. And if we haven't got the iodine, which is a common deficiency on root crops, we can end up with stillbirths and other problems too. Iodine and selenium work together, for instance, to help the lamb mobilize brown fat at birth and stay warm and avoid hypothermia. So those two are pretty critical to have good levels within the lamb itself. Lack of copper. Copper is involved in development of the nervous system, and if it's lacking in mid-pregnancy when the fetuses are developing, then they can develop swayback. So, but I would say to all of these things about trace elements, only supplement if a need has been identified. It is very easy to kill ewes with excess copper, and there have been incidences of excess selenium causing toxicity too. And excess iodine has been shown to reduce the absorption of cholesterol antibodies in newborn lambs. So you can overdo it. So please get advice on trace element supplementation if you are seeing any of these particular problems. So moving on to pregnancy scanning, this is our starting point, in my view, of measuring success of the production cycle. So what does it do for us? It identifies barren ewes early so that we can actually cull them out of the flock. Barren ewes need to be off the farm fairly quickly. They are an expense that you don't need and are eating valuable forage stocks. But before you sell them, before you actually send them down the road to the market, I would ask your vet to investigate why they are empty. Some you may be able to explain yourself without actually getting the vet to look. But if you've got more than 2% empty at scanning, then please ask your vet to do some investigations. It could be infectious abortion. Toxoplasma is a common one for high levels of barren ewes, but there are lots of other reasons for an animal to be barren. So please do get some advice from your vet about that. And don't just sell them, because they have information to tell you about their health and nutritional status perhaps. So please do make use of those animals. It actually allows us to give preferential feeding to ewes carrying multiples. The requirements of a single are a lot less than a twin, and certainly a lot less and even more, even lower than, much lower than for triplets. So that really helps to focus where more food is needed and to have a better outcome. If we end up feeding singles far too much, then we often have difficult lambings and high mortality rate. So actually being able to separate the animals according to the number of lambs they're expecting is a really valuable management tool. It also, quite a few scanners are able to split ewes into early, mid and late lambing groups, and you could do this by raddle colours if you've changed the raddles on the rams every 10 days or so through tupping. But this really helps in terms of limited housing if you're bringing ewes inside, and certainly in terms of when you start supplementation. So that again can help to limit the amount of supplementation that's required. So we need to plan feeding. So once you have your scanning results, you can actually think about what grass is required, what stocking rates you can use, and the rations you're going to use if you are housing your animals for lambing. And the really valuable bit of information is also how many lambs are you expecting? How many successful pregnancies are there? How many lambs are inside those ewes? So we have a baseline to work from for any lambs lost from now on, be that through abortion, be that through loss of ewes at twin lamb or prolapse, or watery mouth at birth, or anything. It would be very, very valuable in any flock to record the reasons for lambs being lost, because reviewing that information is vital in terms of actually improving performance for next year. So that figure, compared to the number of lambs reared at the end of the day, be that sold finished, retained to stores, or kept for breeding, or sold for breeding, is a really, really valuable bit of management information. So do make sure to keep that, keep your loss records as accurately as you can. So just thinking about planning those diets, in mid-pregnancy now is generally, mid-pregnancy is a time when most sheep farmers are relatively quiet and take advantage of a few days shooting perhaps, but there are jobs to be done, and I know through the work I've been doing with Farming Connect that masses of you are out there getting forages analysed. So get your conserved forages analysed so that we have an idea of the metabolisable energy, crude protein, etc., so that we can tailor diets to suit your animals. So also it's a good idea to be working out if you've got sufficient feed for the winter. Rather than running out and having to get emergency supplies, it's much better if you worked out what you need now and have been planning buying some in if you need some extra feed. So calculate real yield of root crops, use a quadrat, a metres quadrat, and estimate that through the usual calculations. Weigh and measure silage, count your number of bales of hay or silage, and work out how much silage dry matter is in your clamps so that you know you're going to have enough to see you through the winter. And then it's important to get that forage analysis, the amount you've got, and then tailor rations to the number of ewes, the body condition score, and the litter size. So if ewes at scanning, and that's a really good time to be condition scoring ewes, if ewes at scanning are thinner or fatter than they need to be, then that is a time to start making some adjustments. And if towards a late pregnancy, obviously moving a thin twin into a triplet group would be a good policy to do. So finally, and I think this was covered by my colleague Alice on the evening of this webinar, but just to think about the health issues in mid-pregnancy, infectious abortion, a classic one would be toxoplasmosis. So we need to be avoiding too many cats on any farm, and certainly trying to keep cats out of hay, silage stores, and certainly away from cereals that might be fed to sheep. Liver fluke, obviously in January, can rear its ugly head, and obviously you need a good liver fluke plan. Lameness, something to get on top of before lambing, well before lambing, and certainly before any ewes are housed, because obviously in the conditions of housing, when it's warm and moist underfoot, then the foot rot and CODD bacteria proliferate, and you can get really bad cases of lameness and large numbers. So that's a really important one. Try and keep those ewes' feet as tidy and disease-free as possible in the mid-pregnancy period. Sheep scab often raises its ugly head through the winter and is a continuing problem for everybody, but we can do without that. So good biosecurity, good fencing to avoid anybody else's sheep mixing with yours. And of course, plan your clostridial disease boosters that need to be given to your ewes at least 4 to 6 weeks before lambing. That will protect the ewe and her lambs for some weeks post-birth. So in summary, it's good to keep using good condition throughout pregnancy. So we should not really be letting them lose condition in mid-pregnancy. Try to hold on to that condition. If you can hold on to that, it will pay dividends in terms of lamb birth weight and lamb survival. So try to provide feed so that ewes can gain a little weight between mating and scanning. Make any changes in diet gradual, and plan winter feeding by assessing winter forage supplies and supplementation. Thank you, everybody.
I'd just like this opportunity to take this opportunity to thank everybody very much for their contributions tonight, particularly Alice and Kate under very difficult situation. I think that we may be taken off air very shortly, so I just apologies for interrupting you, Kate, but I just wanted to thank you both very much for your contributions. This ends the webinar series for this year, and we hope to have another series of webinars in January.